When a company moves to SharePoint, it is usually to get away from the dreaded shared drive. However, a SharePoint site collection follows its own best practices, and if not followed, the company ends up building another shared drive, which leads to a lot of unhappy employees. Here are the top 5 areas where you need to ensure you employ best practices for a successful SharePoint implementation. Number 1, structure. When planning out the structure of your SharePoint site collection, make sure to take the necessary time with the necessary stakeholders, as jumping right into the development stage can cause major issues with user friendliness and future functionality. Following SharePoint structure best practices can help increase efficiency and productivity, enhance user buy-in, avoid duplication of information and documents when adding future functionality, and it keeps development costs down. Number 2, sites versus pages. Learning more about the SharePoint various pieces can help the power user properly develop the company site collection. For example, knowing the differences between sites and pages can keep the structure of the SharePoint site collection from spiraling out of control. In general, most people are not sure what to ask for when they need something built for them in SharePoint. It is up to the developer to ask the right questions and build what is needed for the user. If the wrong thing is added, it can cause both immediate and future structural, permission, and functionality issues. Best practices for when to use sites or pages can keep the user experience at an enhanced level. Number 3, metadata, folders, and document sets. One of the biggest complaints we hear about shared drives is how hard it is to find documents, remembering where to store those documents, and ensuring documents are the most current version. Following SharePoint best practices alleviates all of those issues as long as it's not developed like a shared drive. Knowing how to use metadata to tag documents, when to use folders, and what advantages there are to using document sets gives the power user the developmental tools needed to create a problem-free environment. Using best practices for each of these items will keep SharePoint functionality from being hindered and make the process of uploading, finding, and editing documents way easier than using a shared drive. Number 4, permissions. Faulty permission and folder use are the leading causes of issues within a SharePoint site collection and unsuccessfully obtaining user buy-in. Knowing best practices for permissions can also keep your site collection secure and in line with some of the most stringent regulations in the workplace, such as HIPAA and FERPA. Permissions following SharePoint best practices can also ensure that users do not accidentally or purposely make changes to information or documents with no supervision. If you apply best practices in the setup of permissions, users can be empowered to manage their site content without fear of negatively impacting other departments, which in turn allows them to take their sites and make them the most relevant for their needs. Number 5, user adoption. The biggest complaint we hear about new software installation is that the users were told you have to use the software, but no one showed the users how to use it. This method of work enhancement usually backfires and user adoption is usually very low. User adoption is hard enough, especially when users get comfortable with the current process without adding the stress of learning a new software. Knowing best practices and how to build up user adoption during the planning, development, and implementation stages of a SharePoint site collection can bring the whole project to a successful and positive transition. When making the switch to SharePoint, it is very easy to head down the wrong path and build something that's impossible to use. Following SharePoint best practices will enhance user experience and keep users coming back to SharePoint. Look for more SharePoint best practices in the future by clicking our subscribe button.